Okay, welcome back to another After Effects tutorial video where we will be learning about keyframes and what they are and how we can do them in After Effects. So if you watched the last video, I'm just kind of starting where we left off. I've already created a shape in After Effects, and you can just create a shape using your shape tools. That's all we will need to be able to learn the basics of keyframes here. Just make sure you have something like this open, and it can be a circle, a rectangle, no matter what, just have a shape on here that we can keyframe. So I have here my shape layer, and I have all of my basic transformations. So basically what a keyframe does is it tells the program After Effects that I want this square or this rectangle to be here, and then I will also 5 seconds later I want it to be over here. And that's the basics of animation, that the After Effects will then move it over that 5 second period time from here over to here, right? And so that's kind of just the basics of keyframing. And don't worry if you don't get this first off. Keyframing takes a lot of practice, and it is the basics of After Effects. So let's go ahead and let's enable keyframes. So I'm going to keyframe my position first. Over here, next to position, to the left of it, we have this little stopwatch looking guy. I'm going to click on that now that it is blue. That is how I know I have enabled keyframes for position. And you also see this little diamond guy looking over here. And if we look at my workspace, my timeline, you'll also see this little diamond guy over here, meaning that we have our first keyframe starting at the very beginning of our animation here. Now, I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to move my playhead over to this 2 second mark. It doesn't matter where you move it, just as long as you move it out. But I'm going to move mine out 2 seconds, and then I'm going to click and drag my rectangle over to the side. And you'll see this guy kind of appear. This is showing the path that the animation is taking. And you'll also see, now that I've done that, it actually automatically added a keyframe for me in my timeline. So now that we have that, if I go to the beginning and I press play, you'll see that it automatically moves my rectangle from beginning to end. And it'll just loop here if I just keep it playing. But that is what keyframes is. It's telling the computer that, hey, I want my rectangle at the beginning of my animation to be right here, but at 2 seconds, I actually want it to be over here. And that will store that information in those keyframes and then automatically do that transformation across those 2 seconds. So hopefully that makes sense pretty well of like what keyframes really are. Now let's do it with scale as well. And we can make something kind of fun here. So remember, we go over here to this stopwatch. I click on that. That is blue. And let's go over to our 2 seconds thing again. And I'm actually just going to take both of these down to about 0. Let's take it down to 0. And now if I go back and I play it, it will now say, hey, I want my scale for this rectangle at 100% here. But if I play it and go through 2 seconds, it will actually go down to 0. And it gives you kind of this cool disappearing effect, right? Really, the possibilities with keyframes are kind of endless. Let's kind of practice it here with rotation as well. Make sure your playhead is at the start of it. Well, I can't stress this enough. Your playhead is where your keyframe will go. So you have to be aware of where your playhead is when you are adding keyframes. Because you'll see, like, I want this to happen like this. Maybe this is my final animation. But if I come in here and my playhead's right here and I say, oh, actually, I need to change my position. If I start changing my position right here, it will now add a new keyframe, which will mess up my kind of animation that I have going on here. So always be aware of where your playhead is when you're adding keyframes. Let's go ahead and let's mess with our rotation. My playhead's there at the beginning. I'm going to go ahead and enable keyframes, take my playhead over to 2 seconds again, and maybe let's add some spice into it. And actually, I'm going to go here to the beginning, and I'm just going to reset all of my rotation stuff to 0. And then I'm going to go back over to 2 seconds, make sure that I add maybe this, let's just add 1 full rotation. Now that I do that, it'll give me that full rotation, 1 360-degree rotation as it disappears. Now maybe we want to add some keyframes for opacity as well. If I do this, I can kind of create a little fade to black as well. So I'm just going to come over to this second keyframe, say it's at 0. My first keyframe for opacity is at 100. It starts to fade to black as it disappears. So those are kind of the basics of keyframes and how to use them. And you can see how it can kind of get confusing. You have a bunch of different keyframes here and what they are too. It can be kind of confusing to tell what they are here in our timeline area. I'll show you a cool thing real quick. So I'm just going to toggle my shape layer that I have all these keyframes. I'm going to toggle it up so that we don't see any of them so far. And I'm just going to make sure that I'm selected on it. Now, if you want to just mess with singular keyframes, I can use the keyboard shortcuts for those specific basic transformations. So like for position, if I press P, it will show up just my position keyframe that I have there. I can press T, which stands for like transparency, which will also bring up opacity. Transparency, opacity, basically the same thing, but they use T for it, so I can bring up my opacity. I can press R for rotation, S for scale, A for anchor point when we learn about that. But I can basically do that and see all those separately so that I don't get confused by seeing all of them at once. If you still want to see all of them at once, like say you're trying to keyframe both position and scale at the same time, and they kind of need to be coordinated, right? You can press U to see all of your keyframes that you have already added. So for instance, U is interesting because if I remove the keyframes for opacity, and then I press U, it won't show up my opacity anymore. So U only shows all the things that have keyframes on them already. And so you can be able to edit those at the same time with each other if they are needed to be edited that way. So that's kind of the basics of keyframes. And like I said, After Effects is built upon keyframes. Keyframes is the building blocks of After Effects, and you can keyframe anything. Like I can keyframe an effect that I add from After Effects into my shape layer. I can keyframe that. And so these are the most important things to learn, and yet it takes a lot of time to be able to master keyframes and kind of get it wrapped around your head. So don't worry if you don't have it too much right now. Just continue to practice on After Effects. But that's kind of it for this video on keyframes. Go ahead and join us next time for a more in-depth look on shape layers. We'll be recreating the video game Pong in After Effects, so that'll definitely be one to enjoy.